that. Great. All right. So, yeah, my name is Diane Silver. I am the program coordinator for our partnerships department at FairVote. And I'm here to tell you why ranked choice voting is a better way to vote. So just real quick, FairVote is a nonpartisan champion of electoral reforms that give voters a greater choice, greater voice, and a representative democracy for everybody. That's who we are. And I put this slide in just as a recap because I had been assured that you all know already what the myriad of problems are with our current method of voting. Plurality voting is a winner-take-all system, and it has all of these problems. Vote splitting, when there's more than two candidates, the vote is often split multiple ways, and we end up with non-majority winners. The more candidates there are, the more fractured the vote can become, and so people can win office with, a low plurality, like 20% of the vote, which means 80% of the voters wanted somebody else. So that's a big problem. That vote splitting leads to strategic voting, where voters have to play mind games. Well, I really like so-and-so, but I don't know, they're a long shot, so maybe I'd better not vote for them, even though I like them, that kind of thing. We think that that's a big weakness. Because of the dynamic of vote splitting and that spoiler effect, candidates get encouraged not to run. Don't run, you're just gonna pull votes away from so-and-so, and then the other side is gonna win, regardless of which side you think is the other side. There's a problem with wasted votes. Voters might feel that voting for the candidate they really like the best is a waste of their vote if they're that long shot candidate. There's also the problem in primary elections where if you utilize early voting, which is a good thing for voter access, if you vote for somebody who drops out before your election day, then you've wasted your vote. And that has happened to millions of voters in the previous two presidential primary cycles. We all know about the problem with hyperpartisanship in our elections, so I won't even belabor that. Negative campaigning and gaming the system. Both sides have been guilty of manipulating the system in some way to encourage a third-party candidate for the other side to create that vote splitting effect, or to support a candidate for the other side in the primary so that they'll have a weaker opponent in the general, all kinds of situations like that that involve gaming the system. So these are all problems that we need to resolve, and ranked choice voting is the great solution out there that solves all of these problems. So just real quick, I believe that most of you are familiar with what ranked choice voting is and how it works, but I'll run through it real quick. For the voters, it's super easy. You just rank the candidates, first choice, second choice, third choice. And this is the answer to the question before we got started, that yes, the ballot has very clear instructions that your preferred candidate, your top choice candidate, is the one that you vote for number one. That's your first choice. And then your second choice candidate, you vote for number two, and so on. Just like shown here on the ballot, you bubble in, make sure that you only bubble in one per row and one per column. So the ballots are easy to follow and very straightforward. Ranking is not a new thing for voters. We do ranking all the time. Please go get me ice cream. What flavor do you want? Well, get me chocolate. If they don't have chocolate, get me strawberry. If they don't have strawberry, get me vanilla. That's a ranked choice. I'm not saying that voting is the same as choosing ice cream. I'm just saying that ranking is familiar to voters. So then, once the votes are in, we tally the votes. And the way that it works is we require a majority to win. This is single winner ranked choice voting. So I'm going to just focus on the single winner option for now. It requires a majority which is more than 50%. So if nobody gets 50%, then what we do is we eliminate the last place vote winner. And then we have what's called an instant runoff. It's as if everybody goes back to the polls to vote again with only the remaining candidates. If your top choice is still in the game, then you vote for them again. They're still your top choice. It's only these voters who chose D who would need to make a different choice. But they have done that on their ballot by ranking their vote. The election officials or the algorithm knows what that choice would be. And so the votes are reallocated to that second choice, and we tally the votes again. So this is the next round of counting. It's a runoff. It's just an instant runoff. In this round, once again, nobody has reached that majority threshold, more than 50%. So the same thing happens. The lowest vote getter is eliminated. If the one you voted for before is still in the game, you vote for them again. It's only if your choice got eliminated, you have to make a new choice. So those votes get allocated as indicated, and we count again. And eventually we're down to 2 candidates and there's a winner. So that's the bottom line of how it works. There are many benefits to this system. I'll go through a few of them. The first one is more choice and more voice. So not just B&B, that stands for bullets and babies. And what we're getting at here is that in our current system, the candidates are forced to basically align with one platform or another, and all of the issues get bundled under one platform, and voters tend to vote on hot button issues and we're not really attending to the wide array of issues that really affect our society. The M&V stands for masks and vaccines, which is the new hot button issues that are likely to drive elections coming up. But many voters are not 100% all or nothing aligned with one platform or the other. There's actually usually nuance when you talk to people about what their views are on a range of issues. Many voters are conservative on some issues and progressive on others, or there might be nuance along the political spectrum of how they feel. And so being able to have a broader field of candidates is a good thing, as long as it doesn't introduce strategic voting. Somebody needs to mute their microphone. Thanks. So as long as having that broad field doesn't create that vote splitting that leads to strategic voting, having a broad field can be a good thing because it provides more options. It provides more nuance in the candidates' platforms. You could have a couple candidates who are all in agreement on the hot button issues, but they might have differences on some of the other issues that get less attention under our current system. The more voice part is that voters' preferences can carry all the way to the end if they wish, if they utilize all the opportunities to express their preferences. And so their vote has a lot more power than this simple plurality voting, where they only get to choose one. Another benefit is reduced polarization. So we all know how our current system has created the hyper partisanship that we are suffering from right now. With ranked choice voting, there's an incentive for candidates to reach beyond their base. In order to achieve that 50% threshold to win, you need to have broader outreach. And so you can't just rely on your base and spew the traditional partisan line and count on being able to sail into office because your base is going to turn out. It requires candidates to reach for a broader level of support. And it penalizes mudslinging because in order to get that 50% threshold, you're likely going to need second and third choice votes. And so it's not in your interest to alienate the supporters of one of the other candidates. And so it incentivizes candidates to focus on issues rather than character assassination. Another important benefit is reflective representation. With ranked choice voting, we have found through the data that more women and people of color win office. And that gives us a governing body, whatever level of government we're talking about, whether it's the state legislature or whether it's, mayoral or city council or the school board, whatever it is, we get more reflection of the electorate as a whole with ranked choice voting elections. And we have data to document that. When I get through, I'll put some links in the chat to some of the studies that we have that show that that's true over time. We have analysis from about 20 years worth of elections from 1995 to 2015 that document that effect. And then we did a follow-up study that just came out last spring that really digs into what the mechanisms are with ranked choice voting that are enabling that to happen. One important one, just as an example, is that, for example, when candidates of color run against each other in the same election, they tend to win. They're not crowding each other out. In our current system, there's been a phenomenon of sort of behind the scenes management, if you will, where party leaders or cohort leaders, have a wait your turn philosophy, where they feel like we can only afford to run one Black candidate, or we can only afford to run one Asian candidate. And so other good candidates have to wait their turn. With ranked choice voting, that doesn't happen, and we get better reflection overall. So enough of that. In short, ranked choice voting solves all of these problems that I showed you before. Instead of vote splitting, votes consolidate around majority preference. Instead of non-majority winners, we always have majority winners. Instead of strategic voting, voters are safe to vote for their true favorite. Instead of limiting choice by candidates being discouraged from running, we can get a range of platforms and not just focus on the hot button issues. We reduce those wasted votes because your voice carries through to the end. There's less hyper-partisanship because you have those incentives to reach to beyond the base. There's less negative campaigning, and it is virtually impossible to manipulate the ranked choice system. So that's all of the benefits. The other thing that's really important is that we want to make sure that we are shifting to an electoral system that meets the most critical elements of reform. And so those are there's a number of them. The first one is it's got to be easy for the voters. And ranked choice voting is easy for voters. Through hundreds of ranked choice voting elections with exit polling, we have data that shows that voters report that it's easy to use. And the interesting thing is that the longer that ranked choice voting has been in use in a particular jurisdiction, the higher those numbers get. So there are some early studies when ranked choice voting was first introduced in a particular area where the numbers showed that some populations, like older voters, I think is one that's cited, the percentage that said they found it easy to use was a little bit lower than the population as a whole. It was still a high number. Certainly a majority of voters in that cohort said it was easy to use, but it wasn't as high as the population as a whole. The thing that's interesting is that even though that group expressed a little less confidence in their understanding, they actually did not demonstrate any increase in ballot error compared to plurality voting. So voters are able to do ranked choice voting easily, even if some of them say that they don't understand it as well. And as it gets used more and more, that level of reporting gets higher. The current data is that 90% of voters express satisfaction with ranked choice voting. They prefer it to their previous method and they want to keep it. And that's from decades of use. Another important critical element is it's got to not encourage strategic voting. Those mind games that I was talking about before of, oh, I really like so-and-so, but I better not. But if other people say they won't, then I ought to do this. Voters need to not do that, right? I'm thinking about, you're a mom with 3 kids and 2 jobs and the car broke down and 100 things going on. You don't need more homework of trying to figure out how to be savvy about your vote. With ranked choice voting, the best strategy is to simply vote honestly. It's very difficult to game the system, either as an individual voter or as a party strategist trying to manipulate the system. Another really important element is what we call later no harm. It's really important that indicating a preference indicating a lower preference never hurts your higher preference. And that is true for ranked choice voting. So with ranked choice voting, It's one person, one vote in each round. So each round of tallying, again, we call it an instant runoff because that's essentially what it is. It's as if you were going back to the polls to vote again. And in each one of those, you know, trips to the polls, except it's not a physical trip, it's instant, each voter gets one vote, and it goes to the candidate that's ranked highest on their ballot that's still in the race. And even if you indicate lower rankings, they don't mean anything unless your higher choices have been eliminated. So that is an important element for ranked choice voting. Then another really important element is for your vote to count as long as possible in the process. Best practices, in our opinion, is for voters to be allowed to rank as many as they wish. The more you rank, the more influence you have in those final results, because again, each round of tallying is like a runoff. So if there are 10 candidates in the race and you rank 3 of them, and then you say, I hate all the rest and I'm not ranking them anymore, that's fine, but that's as if you're saying, I'm not going to the runoff anymore. If my top 3 choices have all been eliminated, I'm not even going to bother to show up. And that happens a lot in in-person runoffs. The voter participation rate really drops off in in-person runoffs, whereas with ranked choice voting, when voters can express all of those choices in one showing at the polls, the participation rate in those runoffs is much higher. There have been some critiques that as the crowd gets more and more fractured, more and more full, it can become unwieldy for voters to rank all of the candidates. And so there's talk about maybe limiting the number of rankings. And the goal is to find the happy medium, to allow voters to rank as many as seems manageable before it becomes, you know, too hard to handle, without limiting them and reducing their voice. So ranked choice voting can do that. We can find that happy medium, and so we get more voice all the way to the end of the process. And then finally, ranked choice voting is tried and true. It has been in use for over 100 years in Australia and close to that in some other countries. It's been in use for over 40 years in Cambridge, Massachusetts, over 10 years in the Bay Area and in Minnesota, and it is growing fast. It's been adopted by over 50 jurisdictions thus far, and over all those years, there have been hundreds of elections that have used ranked choice voting. Tens of millions of ballots have been cast, and that is the data from which we analyze how voters actually behave and how ranked choice voting actually works in the real world, in real practice. So all of these claims about how great it is are documented in that data, and that's why we feel really strongly in being able to make these claims. So my bottom line, ranked choice voting solves the biggest problems with plurality voting, and it's the best alternative out there without creating any new problems. It has the fewest weaknesses, and it's strong in the most critical ways. It's easy for voters. There's no strategic voting. It meets that later no harm criterion. Votes count for as long as possible in the process, and it's tried and true with lots of data and lots of documentation. So, phew, that's my 20 minutes. And so, whoops, come on, my slide just suddenly stopped switching, but fortunately it stopped at just the right place because it simply says thank you, and are there any questions?
Can you unshare the screen?
I can unshare my computer. Shoot, my computer seems frozen. There we go.
Okay, thank you so much. Appreciate that. I'm back.
Welcome back.
It was no fun, I'll tell you that much. Thank you very much, Diane. One thing I would have said before you started, I will now stick to Mark, poor fella. I have a timer and for 20 minutes. And what I also have, come on, start video. Anyway, what I have is a bright yellow up in front of my face when my face starts to show when there's only 2 minutes left of the 20. And then Diane, you'll have a chance to ask more questions, and Mark will have a chance to ask you questions. This is the sign. It just, of course, it's backwards. Sorry about that. That's what I do with our screen here. But fine, let's go ahead. Thank you very much. And thank you, all of you, for standing in for me. I appreciate it a lot. Mark, are you still there?
I am. Let me go ahead and share screen here.
Okay.
And I'll say at the outset that one thing that I think is 100% true is that the election reform community has the same end goals in terms of really creating a fair election system for the voters. The issues in terms of removing wasted votes, removing strategic voting, removing the spoiler effect, and so on. Those are all certainly goals that we share. The reason why, ultimately the reason why star voting was invented is because no system that was currently being proposed had those features. And I think actually a great many of the advocates for star voting actually started out as supporters of ranked choice voting, instant runoff, myself included. By way of introduction, I'm Mark Frohnmayer. I'm the founder of the Equal Vote Coalition, and alongside Rob Ritchie of FairVote and Clay Shentrup, who was with the Center for Election Science, I am one of the 3 accidental creators of the star voting method. Star voting was actually invented in Oregon in 2014 at the end of a day-long event called the Equal Vote Conference, where we had people from FairVote and people from Center for Election Science and a whole bunch of other organizations come out for a day and debate about voting methods. And at the end of that day, Rob Ritchie actually proposed a compromise system where voters could both approve of and rank candidates on a single ballot, and suggested that that might be something, a point of collaboration. And what that evolved into was the realization that that a star ballot carries with it both information about ranking and information about approval or overall support for a candidate. And that's really how star voting came about. But the fundamental idea of the Equal Vote Coalition is that every vote needs to doesn't just need to count, it needs to count equally. That's it's baked into the principle of one person, one vote, that your vote and my vote should carry the very same weight, no matter how many candidates are on one side. And I think we'll skip through or go quickly through the problem because we all understand the lesser evil voting incentive that comes when you've got your favorite, but you don't think that favorite has a good chance of winning, so you vote for the lesser evil to prevent your worst outcome from coming to pass. That's sort of what we see as kind of the worst form of strategic voting incentive. Is the worst incentive to a voter is to vote against your actual beliefs. And that's captured in FairVote talks a lot about the later no harm criterion. The other side of that is the favorite betrayal. So favorite betrayal means that the voting system gives you an incentive to vote against your favorite in favor of a more likely to win second or third choice. So when we think of equality in the vote, vote splitting is at its root is an inequality in the vote itself, where the more candidates that you like, the worse off you are. So if on your side you have 2 or 3 or 4 very good choices, and on the other side there's just one, the other side will concentrate their votes. The people who think like you will split their votes, and the outcome won't reflect the will of the majority. And what star voting does, and it is a very simple system that uses the same, what is now the ubiquitous 5-star concept, 0 bad, 5 good. And it is counted in just 2 steps always. First, you add up all the stars, whichever 2 candidates got the most stars, those are the finalists. And then your vote goes to whichever of those finalists you gave more stars. If you gave them both the same number of stars, well, that's a vote of no preference. And so what ends up happening is that from both the ballot side and the actual tabulation of the results, it's entirely transparent to voters. It can be summed by precinct, so you can come up with a partial sum. You know, this is particularly important for how we vote in Oregon, because we sum up the elections county by county by county, and then all those votes are sent into the state for final tabulation for statewide races. If you have a system that requires that instant runoff algorithm to play, all of that vote data has to be in one central spot. And we've definitely seen elections, particularly now in statewide races, where results are delayed. I think this was certainly a factor in Maine by sometimes days or weeks, because all of that data has got to be collected in one spot. So with STAR, it always completes in 2 rounds. And what's really what's also really critical to us is that it's not just about expressing a preference on the ballot. The equal vote comes from all of those expressions of preference actually being counted by the system. So in STAR, you add up all of your preferences, and then your vote goes to whichever of those 2 finalists you gave a higher score. So STAR 100% of the time produces the majority winner between the 2 most supported candidates in the field. If you have a ranked choice election, that it will work 100% of the time if you have 2 strong candidates and a bunch of weak candidates. But what can happen, and this is really kind of to the point, is that instant runoff only looks at, when it is counting, it only looks at your current first choice. And so if your second choice on the ballot is eliminated prior to your first choice, that second choice vote will never be counted. And that doesn't cause a problem if you've got 2 strong candidates and a bunch of weak candidates. But as soon as you have actually a number of viable candidates in the field, it can cause really sideways results to happen. And that's one of the reasons why STAR voting came about, was sort of to fix that problem. In terms of transparency, this would be what a STAR voting election tabulation would look like. Here are the candidates in the field. Here are the top 2, Desi and Bianca, and then how many voters scored Desi higher versus Bianca. That's the winner. The problem that Diane alluded to, and this is I actually had a chance to speak with a gentleman who moved up from San Francisco and used ranked choice for many years, was just, as you get more and more candidates on the ballot, it becomes harder and harder to rank them, because you're having to keep in your mind a sorted list of every candidate that's out there. The advantage with STAR is that you can actually just look at each candidate one by one by one by one and go 0 to 5, 0 bad, 5 good, and that the fact that in that runoff round, your preference is what makes the choice. So you can have, if there's a candidate here on the ballot that is, you know, I see Blake and Ella as both are poor choices, but I like Ella a little bit more than Blake, I can give Ella just 1 star, knowing that if those 2 are the finalists, my vote will still always be counted. And that's that equality factor really is, it's why the Equal Vote Coalition is called the Equal Vote Coalition. It's time for our votes to actually be counted equally. And that is what STAR offers. There are a number of ranked systems that do provide that. So ranked choice has been is a relabeling of one way of counting ranked ballots. There are many ways to count ranked ballots, and some of them provide an equal weight vote. Unfortunately, instant runoff doesn't do that. And when it comes to the simplicity of the system for voters, and I think we had a little bit of a conversation about New York and some of the stuff that went on there, but at the end of the day, it's super important, not just that the ballot is easy for the voter to interact with, but that when you count it up, it's very easy for voters to understand what went on. And if you've seen a ranked choice election with a dozen or 2 dozen candidates, this election result spreadsheet it will have 1 column for every candidate in the race. And it's honestly, even for someone who is very savvy with voting methods, it can be really hard to discern what actually happened in the election and get that confidence that as a voter, the fair outcome came about. And that's one of the things we really like about STAR, is that the election results are immediately transparent. You see, here are all the candidates. Here are what their average score was. Here are the top two. Here's how many preferred candidate A over candidate B. And that's why we think STAR is really, for us, it balances a bunch of different criteria. The criteria that we think are very important at the Equal Vote Coalition is it's got to be easy, it's got to be simple, it's got to be easy to understand. The 5-star rating is so ubiquitous now. Every app on your phone asks you regularly to give it a 5-star review. Amazon, Google, if you ever had a star chart as a kid, I mean, this is the notion of scoring from 0 to 5 is very well understood. And we found that voters who use the STAR voting system grasp it very quickly. It's got to be safe to vote your conscience. And that this idea of balancing the criterion of later no harm, where if I express a secondary preference, I don't want that to hurt my first choice. The nice thing about STAR is that you know that 2 candidates go to that runoff step. That's what gives you confidence that you can vote for, you can offer support to additional candidates. But the other piece that's super important, and again, the worst kind of strategic voting, is what is known as favorite betrayal, which is where you are incentivized to vote against your true favorite. That is the one that leads to bipolarization of the electorate, that kind of 2-party domination. And that is one thing that RCV does not fix that STAR does. And that's it's a nuanced thing to get there, but that fact that you can have an election where you've expressed a whole set of preferences, but your second choice doesn't count. As soon as you hit an election where that happens in a meaningful way, one, that will tilt to the polarizer, not to the person who's in the center of public opinion. And you can look at, there's a fairly well understood election that happened in Burlington in 2009 under instant runoff, where that happened, elected a polarizing candidate and led to the repeal of the system the next year. If the people on the other side had done the lesser evil voting, they would have gotten the consensus choice. But they were told that they should just vote honestly. They did, and that's one of the reasons why we think STAR is such an important step forward. And then, the accuracy component is that any election system that we have should let us vote our preferences and then should accurately reflect the will of the electorate. And what we found after conceptualizing STAR voting back in 2014, a number of election scientists have done really comprehensive analyses from a simulation point of view and found that STAR really performs at the very top of the pack in terms of an accurate reflection of the summation of the will of the voters. And then finally, it can't play favorites. And so that equality component is really, really key to us. This is an example. So ranked pairs is a ranked system that passes that equality criterion. Approval voting, of course, passes it, and then STAR does as well. This is another note in terms of accuracy. Of course, the system that we're using today, when run in simulation, is the worst. We use presently the worst system in terms of accurately reflecting the will of the electorate that people have ever come up with as a voting system. There's widespread agreement in election reform that what we're doing now is terrible, and we've got to change it. And we're just proposing that we go from the worst to what is certainly arguably the best across these various categories. Another piece of this, and this kind of comes back to the tabulation of results, but one of the things our system right now does a very poor job of is showing support for secondary and tertiary candidates in the results of the election. So if you have a plurality voting election, you've got 2 strong polarized candidates and a bunch of other candidates that people might really like, the Green Party or the Libertarian Party candidate or an independent or whatever. The election results will almost always show like a fraction of the electorate support for those those tertiary candidates, which leads the public to believe that there's like no support for anything but the red and the blue. If you have a system that can actually show the support for all the candidates, that means that over subsequent election cycles, you'll be able to build up a showing of support for what might be considered alternate viewpoints, but really in a lot of cases would be considered truly consensus viewpoints amongst the electorate. And that's one of the other pieces, is not just thinking about this, how does this work in one election, but how does an election system work over time to more and more and more accurately reflect the will of the electorate and bring the system together. So the star voting is adaptable. When we first conceived it, it was a single winner election mode. There's been a lot of research work done over the last several years in terms of developing multi-winner variants of the system, proportional representation versions of the system. It is precinct summable. It is risk limiting auditable. It doesn't require new voting machines or hardware. It's just a fairly simple software change to what we have today. I actually tested this. I took the results of did I use our ballot counting software results that come out of our current balloting systems in Lane County, and wrote I think it was a 40-line Python script in about 2 hours to compute a star voting result from that very same ballot. So with that, I think that I'm not sure if I hit even my 2-minute mark, Georgia, but
you haven't.
I figured let's save the rest for robust conversation. And again, I think for us, it's really important that we talk not just about the goals, but about how each approach and whether each approach really achieves those goals. Because I think there is a great alignment on the overall outcome that we're all shooting for, which is a system that's truly equal and fair for all of us. And so, diving into the nuance is something that I think helps really clarify that.
Thank you. Okay. Diane, would you like to ask Mark some questions?
I could frame some things as questions, or I have some responses.
Okay.
If that's all right. My understanding is I have about 10 minutes now. Is that right?
You do. You're on.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen again for
Sure.
just a minute, because that'll be a way to start. So Mark has raised a lot of interesting points, and I want to say thank you for lots of things. I agree that we are in agreement that plurality voting is terrible, and we are in agreement in the big picture that we need that every vote should count equally. In our current system, it doesn't, and the only differences really are these nuances of which system is really the best and the most powerful. So one thing I wanted to share is the example of the transparency of the results. I agree 100%. Transparency of results is very important. And so happily, ranked choice voting is completely transparent in the reporting of results. There are a couple different formats in which it can be reported. Here's a modest one, what we call the single table summary, that shows you how, round by round, what the results were and which candidate got eliminated and how the votes were redistributed until there's finally a winner. This is a simpler example. This one, let's see. Oops, it's not advancing. Come here. This one is a little bit more. What happened? That's not the one. That's not where I thought it was. Sorry, it's not going where I thought it was going to go. I apologize. I'll leave it at that one. Another a big issue that I regret to be the messenger on this is that the star voting system sounds really good in concept. The problem is that it breaks down in real practice. Because of the mechanism of this 5-star rating, rating your second choice or your third choice honestly can enable that candidate to win ahead of your top choice. And so what happens is if you feel strongly about one candidate, many voters will choose not to give points to any other candidates than the one they like the best. It's called bullet voting. And there's not a lot of data for star voting because it's not very well tested. But when it has been used, we found that a majority of voters actually did not give points to anyone other than their favorite. They voted for only one candidate. In the Oregon independent primary in which star voting was used, in all 3 races on that ballot, the majority of voters gave points to only one candidate. So it sounds good in theory, but it fails to take into account real voter behavior. And so again, we just feel like ranked choice voting is tried and true. It's been tested over hundreds of ranked choice elections, and we find that in 70% of those ballots cast, the voter expressed multiple preferences when offered the opportunity to do that. Another problem is that in the way that star voting works is you get to score all of the candidates on this 1 to 5 system, but only 2 of them advance. And so if you scored both of those candidates with the same score, let's say that you gave 5 stars to your top choice, and then there were a couple candidates who you were pretty okay with, and so you gave them 4 stars, and then there's one who you gave 3, and so on. If the 2 that make it to the runoff are 2 of the ones to whom you gave 4 stars, your rating for those 2 candidates in the runoff is the same. And that means that your ballot gets thrown out. Your ballot does not count in that runoff round because the voting officials can't determine who your ballot should go to because you gave both of them the same. I'm going to finish my 10 minutes, Mark, and then all right.
I mean, I'd love to have a conversation, but that's if you give 2 candidates the same score, you're not expressing a preference between them.
Well, Mark, I'm going to finish my 10 minutes, okay, yeah. and then you can respond.
Let her finish, Mark. So, thank you.
So the issue with that system is that usually most voters do in fact have a preference between candidates. And so with 5 stars, if there's more than 5 candidates, you're forced to start giving some of those candidates the same rating, even though you might in fact have a preference among them. And so you're not able to distinguish what your preference is. On the other hand, if you say, well, I feel in the general, I feel pretty equal with these 2. But then if there was a runoff, like imagine for yourself, let's say that you actually had an in-person runoff. You had, these 10 candidates in the first round and you scored them, and then 2 of them go to the runoff. When you go to that runoff, you're probably going to have a preference of one over the other. But because of the way that the system is combined with the scoring for round 1, but then the runoff in round 2, you're not able to express that preference in round 2. And so the problem is that, again, it's not just about it. The system is theoretical because it's been devised without really taking into consideration what true voter behavior is. But what we've seen in the time that it was used was, again, a majority of voters only voted for one candidate because they didn't feel safe voting for multiple candidates. Whereas in ranked choice voting, you get to express that preference, whatever the differential preference is, you get to rank order them, and so your vote always counts. There was a comment in the chat about somehow that the vote transfers don't work in ranked choice voting. I didn't get a chance to read the comment in detail, but I will say this: there's no perfect system. Mark mentioned that at the beginning. There's no system that can meet every single criterion that's important. And so the thing is that we have to decide which criteria are the most important and which ones happen most frequently, or in which system do the weaknesses happen most frequently. So with star voting, that disenfranchisement of voters in that runoff round is frequent. It happens a lot. Or the voters know that it could happen and they only vote for one candidate. And so it breaks down and goes back to plurality voting. Whereas with ranked choice voting, for example, Mark gave an example of a weakness of ranked choice voting of this favorite betrayal. And that is a possibility. It's happened, I think, once, maybe twice in the hundreds of ranked choice voting elections that have taken place. It's very, very rare. And as Mark noted, there have to be a set of circumstances that all align in order for it to happen. You have to have a couple of candidates and two or three who are equally viable in order for that favorite betrayal problem to happen. And the incidences of all of those circumstances aligning is very, very rare. And as ranked choice voting gets adopted and gets more common, it's going to open up the field and encourage more candidates to run. And as you have a broader field, then you don't have that problem with just 3 candidates in the example that Mark gave. And so the bottom line is that the frequency of that problem happening in ranked choice voting is very, very rare, whereas the frequency of disenfranchisement with star voting is very common. And so that's a reason why we feel that ranked choice voting is stronger. And again, I'm not trying to diss. I love the idea in concept. I think it's so clever, and I really admire the clever thinking behind it. The problem is it just doesn't hold up in practice. Mark invoked Rob Ritchie, who is our founder and president of FairVote, I guess in the hopes of trying to suggest that Rob, supports star voting. Rob Ritchie is a thinker, a sophisticated thinker, and he's not afraid to put out, ideas, but then once they get tested, he's also not afraid to admit when he was wrong. And Rob has admitted quite openly that he made a mistake. It sounded good on the surface, but in fact, star voting has not held up when you bring in voter behavior.
Diane, I'm going to have to cut you off. You got your 10 minutes. And
that's my 10 minutes. All right. Well, thank you for the opportunity to respond to those key points.
Okay. Mark, you've got 10 minutes.
All right. Here we go. I just want, Diane, I would recommend you guys, your data is way out of date on star voting in terms of where it's been used. We have now a ton of case studies. That's not to mention literally the hundreds of elections with many thousands of votes cast at the Star.vote website for everything from what ice cream flavor should we get to straw polls on presidential primaries. But it is now, star has now been used by it was used by the Independent Party of Oregon. It's now being used in Democratic Party of Oregon. And we've got a bunch of case studies on the website. I would encourage everyone to give a look at starvoting.us/case studies. This whole notion that you are disenfranchised. I mean, one of the great advantages of star is that you can express an equal preference. If I've got 20 candidates on the ballot and I'd be happy with 3 or 4 or 5 of them all getting the job, that's a huge win to be able to say, like, let's say that I'm a progressive in the Democratic Party, and if it's Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders, give them both 5 stars. As the voter wins either way if those are the 2 finalists. That's the whole point. The runoff step in star voting is an opportunity to express preference, but it's not a requirement. So the notion that you are somehow disenfranchised because you didn't express a preference between the 2 finalists, you expressed the most important thing, which is how much do you support that candidate to be one of the, to be one of the finalists. You said, I want, my preference as a voter is that these 3 candidates all receive the top score from me. That's the voter's choice. The voter is the one saying, I'm going to give these all an equal rating on the ballot. And so the notion that they are deprived of a preference choice there, it's just simply not true. As far as, and that's, again, it's one of those things where I would actually recommend, rather than blathering on about it in too much more detail, Sarah Wolk did post some stuff in the chat. I would certainly be happy to open to Q&A. Oh, look, Sarah, you got your hand up. Would you like to ask a question in my 10 minutes?
Yeah, I would love to have you or somebody explain the difference between an exhausted ballot in ranked choice voting, which is a ballot that isn't able to transfer a vote that's not counted in the deciding round in ranked choice, and a vote of no preference in star.
And I think to the point of disenfranchisement, the whole idea of having an equal voting system is that we could have many viable candidates show up on the ballot. And if you have a voting system that breaks and has a higher chance of breaking the more viable candidates you have, which is the case with instant runoff, it ends up devolving into still a two-party dominated system. And Diane, you brought up Australia. The lower house in Australia is elected using instant runoff, and that is a two-party dominated election process that has been for 100 years. And there is actually an article on FairVote talking about how the major parties in Australia encourage people to put one of the two major parties in first position rather than vote their true preferences in order to not waste their votes. This is what happened. This is actually what happens in the longest running usage of ranked choice, is devolves into a two-party dominated system where it is the gaming that happens is the public messaging gaming. When you talk about STAR, there's obviously no requirement in STAR that voters express multiple preferences, but the ability to always be able to express multiple preferences and always have those secondary preferences count, that's the real advantage of STAR over instant runoff. So to the question that Sarah was asking, if you have, and there is Burlington is one classic example of this. If you go to equal.vote/Burlington, it walks all the way through it. But if on your ballot, you mark your first choice, second choice, third choice, and your second choice, who might be a very well-liked consensus candidate, but in Burlington, you basically had three dominant candidates. You had the progressive, you had the Republican, and then you had the Democrat, who was right at the center of public opinion. And that Democrat was the second choice of the bulk of the Republicans and the second choice of the bulk of the progressives. But because ranked choice only looks at your first choice, that consensus candidate got eliminated first. Well, after the kind of rounding error candidates but the consensus candidate got knocked out, and so those second choices of the Republican voters were never counted. So you have a system that allows you, in this case, allows you to express a preference, but may or may not actually count that preference. Counted the secondary preferences of some voters, didn't count the secondary preferences of others, did not achieve a majority winner. It achieved a plurality winner, and then it was repealed the next year. So yes, it does require you to have multiple strong candidates in the field for the error to show up in instant runoff. I would argue that having many strong candidates in the field is desirable for voters. We want to have a lot of good choices, and we don't want to be penalized when the voting system breaks because we have lots of viable candidates. The reason why plurality voting does the reason why we only get two choices today is because plurality voting breaks. The system we use now breaks when you have more than two viable candidates. And in some cases, even if you have just more than two candidates, you can have spoiler candidates. But I, for one, would love to have a system where we could have a bunch of great choices on the ballot. And in fact, that the more good choices that we have, the better an outcome will result for all of us. And that's really where I think STAR shines.
Okay, let me open this up for Q&A for anyone who would like to ask a question. And, you know, the whole point is not to have a too active a debate, but to learn more about the two systems and how they can be implemented. I mean, Benton County is very proud of the fact that that's how they elect their commissioners here in Oregon. And there are other counties that are considering it. Jane, you have a question?
Yes, I just wanted to ask Diane and Mark, will it be possible for us to have a copy of your PowerPoints so that we can share those with our minutes?
Absolutely.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you.
I will put my email address in the chat, and then if you could just email it to me, that would be great.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Sarah has got that on the trigger, I believe.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
I just wanted to share as well that a lot of the points that Diane and Mark are debating, and it is kind of devolving into a bit of a he said, she said. And for those of you who don't know which person to believe, I put a bunch of slides that actually have peer-reviewed citations on some of these claims regarding wasted votes, majority winners, vote splitting, all of which are things that ranked choice voting helps, but does not eliminate. And there is really lots of data, articles, academia, and real world examples to refute those.
Thank you. Jean?
Thank you. I mentioned in the introduction that I'm a former legislator, and during my time in the legislature, both of these proposals were presented to us with a little bit of discussion. And very frankly, what happened was people's eyes started to cross, and we walked away from the whole conversation. I'm a little disappointed that this has sort of devolved into a debate, or was referred to as he said, she said. I think my question is, how are you each proposing to get the public to be enthusiastic about a new voting system if it's confusing to them? It's confusing to me right now. And my fear is that people, when they aren't quite sure how this whole stuff is supposed to work, they walk away. The League of Women Voters is enthusiastic about voter participation. I've heard it said that this is easy for voters to use. I've heard some reference to public messaging. I guess I would like to hear from both of you what that public messaging is going to say as to how can you keep it simple and why voters would do it. And frankly, my bottom line recommendation is that you get together and you come up with one system that you're really going to help people understand in order for them to accept it.
Well, Jean, I think your point is very well taken. And this is not, by the way, a new thing. The voting method community, as much as it is an agreement that the problem needs to be fixed, has not yet come to a consensus. Star voting was actually originally designed to be a consensus solution between the camps of approval voting and ranked choice voting. It sort of blends the strengths of both and mitigates the weaknesses of both. But to the point of just like, is it confusing or not? One of the things I would suggest for everyone in the room, I'm going to post a link. Sarah created just as an example, we have a Democratic primary coming up for governor. And we have a bunch of candidates on the ballot. They're all going to be elected. They're going to be elected through that primary using plurality voting. I think there are what, 12, maybe more. So in this link, you can click it and you can just try voting using Star voting and see what you think. And you'll be able to vote, and then you'll be able to see how the results are shown. And I'd encourage, I'm sure there is an online tool similarly that does the same for ranked choice. And I think it'd be a good exercise to look at both and say, how do they work in terms of inputting the ballot? If you've got 12 candidates on the ballot, is it easier to give 0 to 5 stars to each, or is it easier to sort them and rank them? And then when you see the output, is it easier to understand in the Star voting format, or is it easier to understand in the ranked choice format? I mean, just from that simplicity angle, there's no substitute for actually kicking the tires.
Yeah, good point.
Diane, did you want to respond to Jean?
So I'm putting in a link that has a demo for ranked choice voting, similar idea, nothing like using it to get the idea. And Nadia has put in a link to a nice ranked choice voting website that just kind of gives the overview basics. So I feel like to answer your question, first of all, Jean, I do feel like I need to respond to one thing that Mark said earlier, because I think there's some misleading things that have been said, and it's important to be honest. That one problem with star voting is that it is in fact that blend of two different systems. It's, you know, the approval voting of giving the score, and then the runoff, which is a preferential thing. And so there's this problem that is inherent conflict, that you can't express your preference and vote for several candidates equally at the same time. And so I would ask you, just as a voter, to think in your own mind, if there was a runoff of two candidates, there was a separate runoff from the first runoff, would you likely have a preference between those two, or would you absolutely not care which one won? If you're an ardent Democrat, Mark gave the example of Bernie Sanders versus Elizabeth Warren, and when you're looking at a field of 20 primary candidates, you might very well feel that I like Elizabeth Warren, I like Bernie Sanders, yeah, I like them both, they're both good. Certainly when you're looking at them compared to the Republican alternatives that you don't like, you're going to feel like I like them both. But if they were the two that were to go to the runoff, and you were then given the opportunity to say, which one do you actually want in the end, most voters would in fact have a preference. And so by not allowing those voters to express that preference in the runoff, because they gave them the same number of stars in the first round, that is disenfranchisement. You can call it something else if you want, but it actually is. The other problem is that Mark has talked about how ranked choice voting doesn't take into account the second choice until or unless the first choice is eliminated. And my answer to that is, yeah, it's called one person, one vote. And the big problem with star voting is that the opponents are going to immediately jump on it with that legal challenge to say that this is in violation of one person, one vote, because you're voting for multiple candidates in a particular round of voting. Ranked choice voting got hit with that back in Maine, back when it was first being discussed and debated and ultimately adopted. And it had to go through a number of court challenges from opponents who were trying to, eliminate it and go back to plurality voting. And ranked choice voting survived all of those challenges. Court opinions are now in place that say that ranked choice voting is fully constitutional and meets that litmus test of one person, one vote, because in each round of voting, each voter has only one vote, exactly one vote. Their vote goes to one person only. So part of the problem is, as I've said before, that star is tremendously untested. I think I may, if my data was out of date, you've cited 3 examples where star voting has been used instead of just one, and then a number of case studies. That is still not anywhere close to sufficient testing for voters to feel confident that what they're putting in place isn't going to face a court challenge of being unconstitutional. So the answer to your question, Jean, about how are we going to make voters feel comfortable with this for adopting it is exactly the way that we've done it in over 50 jurisdictions across the United States. We're going to, you outline the problems with plurality voting, which happily we all agree on, that plurality voting is terrible and breaks down. I agree with you, Mark. Plurality voting breaks down. We demonstrate all of the benefits of ranked choice voting that I outlined earlier, although I whizzed by them kind of fast because of the time limit. We use demonstration apps like the one that we posted, that Rank It app, where voters can get online and practice ranked choice voting with whatever kind of simulation they want to try. We use the whole range of education and outreach tools that exist from many RCV campaigns that have succeeded in getting ranked choice voting adopted. And we present to them the data from, again, hundreds and hundreds of ranked choice voting races that have been working well for decades. I think that those are just a few of the tools that we would use in our toolbox to, demonstrate to voters why ranked choice voting is a better system. It's tried and true, and it's worth giving a chance, in your community.
Thank you very much, Diane. Judy Casper, did you have a question?
I think I answered it sort of myself by logical process of elimination. When you count the votes, what's the time frame? Is it just going on to the next election, the primary, or the main election? How long does it take to do this?
Either system could be used in a primary election or could be used in a general election. The challenge with using a system that has problems when you have more viable candidates in a single election, like if you want to eliminate the primary and just have one vote, it becomes more and more important that you have a system that actually works with multiple viable candidates. To the point of constitutionality, Sarah did post some stuff in the chat, but the principle of one person, one vote means that all of our, and the Supreme Court's been super clear on this, is that every person's vote should carry an equal weight. That means, and the test for equality of weight is balance. In the context of voting, that means that no matter how you vote, there's a way that I can cast a vote that's in balance with that, such that either the election result is the same, whether or not both of our votes were counted, right? So that, and this, if you're, I would remember, you get the married couple at the table and one votes for the Democrat and one votes for the Republican, that's equal because the election results can be the same, whether or not both or neither of those votes are counted.
Let me just do one thing, since I'm supposed to have led this, although I did a very poor job. Thank you to my computer. Let me ask the two of you a general question. I know that FairVote is in the process of, well, it's only one this time, so it's okay. FairVote is in the process of trying to get federal legislation regarding ranked choice voting. My question to both of you is, does it make sense to try from the local level to build it up to the national level, or does it make more sense to just say, hey, what are our chances of being successful from either building it from the bottom or starting right at the top and saying, okay, just like they're trying to get the fair vote out through the John Lewis passage. Does that make any sense? I'm curious what the likelihood is.
Yeah, it's a good question, Georgia. And I think that my answer would be both and. For example, in Burlington, Mark brought up the example of Burlington. The voters in Burlington have just voted to reinstate ranked choice voting. People love to cite that one example, again, one example out of hundreds and hundreds of ranked choice voting elections in which ranked choice voting actually worked exactly the way it's supposed to work, which is it elected the candidate that was preferred by the majority of voters. It's just that after the fact, that candidate got embroiled in a little bit of a scandal. He was the office holder at that point. And so people became dissatisfied with him, and they used ranked choice voting as a scapegoat that, if we hadn't had ranked choice voting, then somebody else would have won. And because of the dissatisfaction, with this, whatever it was that happened with the scandal, they said, oh, let's just repeal ranked choice voting. They've recognized since then that it actually had nothing to do with ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting put in place the candidate that was preferred at the time of the election by the majority of voters. At the time of the election, the majority of voters were happy with the outcome. And so it worked, and they reinstated it. And so that
repeal campaign started right after the election.
Across the country.
Mark, wait for her to finish, please.
Across the country, we are getting ranked choice voting adopted at the municipal level. So that's what I would sort of think of as the bottom-up approach. And at the same time, it is worth working on federal legislation that brings awareness in Congress and that would help address some of the problems that are a problem, especially with congressional elections, that are a problem across the board. We're working on, for example, a measure within the National Defense Reauthorization Act that would allow overseas military voters to use ranked ballots because they get disenfranchised when there isn't time for their ballot to be mailed back and forth overseas when runoff elections happen so quickly. So that's an example of something that really needs to be done on the national level, and that's an appropriate approach. There's federal legislation we're working on that would provide grant assistance to localities, to municipalities and states to help cover the transition costs, because often that gets cited as an obstacle to making the shift. Whatever system that might be shifted to, there's transition costs in educating the voters. It's going to be different this time. And so that there's a mechanism to help ease that. That's a good strategy, helping to remove that obstacle that city councilors might cite for why they don't want to do it. So Georgia, my answer to you would be yes, both.
Okay, Mark, what do you think? Federal
I apologize. I'm running. I think we're a little bit over time on this.
We are over time.
But I'll give you a couple of thoughts, and then certainly happy to hand the floor to Sarah to carry it a bit further. We have very active campaign efforts in Oregon for the adoption of STAR at the local level. An active Portland chapter, the Democratic Party of Oregon has adopted STAR for a number of their internal procedures. And so I think we've seen voting reform become a more and more pressing issue over time, particularly with the continued polarization at the federal level. And I think that's really brought a lot of people into the interest of pushing for voting method reform, which is a very good sign. So approval voting was adopted in Fargo. Approval voting as a primary was adopted in St. Louis. That was actually a system that was first petitioned here in Oregon in 2013. So it's very cool to see those moves being made. I guess I would just say, one of the great challenges with the notion, well, this has never been used in a public election, so how can we ever use it in a public election? That's the one thing I love about Oregon is that we have a very entrepreneurial spirit. We have absolutely led the way when it comes to voting reform, and I think STAR voting Oregon is a great place to try out STAR, and let's show in the public elections really that Oregon leads the way once again.
Thank you.
Sarah, if you want to, I'm sure there were a number of other bits that could be hit, but I do apologize. I've got to.
No, I appreciate that. And I want to say thank you to Mark and to Diane. Really appreciate all of the information you had. Just fabulous. I really appreciate it.